Werewolves on Wheels. Dear Scary Stories NYC. A lot of people associate motorcycle gangs with the late 1960s and the hippie era. In fact, by that point, some motorcycle gangs had grown into American institutions. The true birth of the American motorcycle gang originated in clubs formed by GIs returning from the big WW2. And in the area I grew up in, stories were handed down to my generation, insisting that some of these motorcycle gangs or clubs had members who were actual, real-life werewolves. I think many of us have heard of the German so-called werewolves during that worldwide conflict. They were not literally wolfmen, though. That was just a code name for them stemming from their savage reputation and intent. These former GIs, at least according to both my grandparents on my mother's side, were literal, shape-shifting werewolves. They were human part of the time, and they were animals the rest. Some of them changed into large four-legged wolf-type creatures, while others transformed into various kinds of bipedal werewolves. Some had dog-like heads, yet maintained bare, human chests. Some grew heads that almost looked more like a long-snouted Sasquatch or gorilla than a canine. There were all different kinds of transformations visible when this freak squad rolled into town on their gas-guzzling old giant hogs. It must have been quite a sight, and I fully expect a photograph of them to emerge eventually. My grandfather told me they allowed no photos, but I'm betting they must have posed for a group shot once or twice. They just had to have. The human ego is too strong for them not to have gotten a portrait done. Sooner or later, I feel confident that proof will emerge that justifies these old legends. Until then, I trust you to recreate the action for us using your creepy, nightmarish Photoshop illustrations. So the reason my grandparents knew about this was one of the guys that Grandpa knew, who he called Scully, supposedly got turned into a werewolf over in Europe during the war. Since they had been buddies in boot camp and kept in touch, Scully felt he had an open invitation to come with the gang and camp out on both Grandpa's front and back lawn. Grandma found herself laundering and mending clothing, and she assured me that werewolves tear their clothing a lot. I would always be amazed to hear these two kind old people discussing the werewolf problem of the late 40s and early 50s in the same way they discussed that time when the Hornets built a nest inside the garage. It was a nuisance they had to deal with and cope with, until then it wasn't. Grandma and Grandpa lived in a small house on his father's ranch and estate in an area that I'm sort of unclear on. I know they were within driving distance to Channing, Texas, which is in the northern part of the state, over by New Mexico and the Oklahoma Panhandle. The Channing Cemetery was featured in one story, where the bikers accompanied the family to the cemetery to pay respects to someone that I suppose they must have known, and chaos erupted inside. Apparently a local pastor or father or something identified the bikers as werewolves and began praying aloud for them to return to hell. Instead, they went ape, causing a heap of destruction before heading back to demand more dinner from my grandma. This led to a big argument between my grandfather and the men, which Grandpa supposedly won. The werewolves returned to the cemetery that night to put the gravestones back in place that they had disrupted, but they were met there by local law enforcement who were disinterested in their kind offer of volunteer work. They were not arrested. Police were too afraid to take them in more than one at a time, but they were asked to disperse. Although the pack seemed to only eat what was served to them while staying with the family, and they obeyed Grandma's request that they remain in human form while indoors, they would openly tell tales of their exploits as a part-time wolf pack. Even in my grandmother's presence, they told shocking stories of the horrible things they had done to human beings just because they could. These stories got passed down to me in my youth, some from my uncle, and some from Grandma and Grandpa themselves. Since these incidents occurred before either of my parents were born, I don't think either of them chose to take any of those stories seriously. I feel strongly they are true, though, because Grandma wouldn't have said it if it wasn't. Grandpa was known to joke around and even play an occasional prank, but Grandma, she didn't understand humor at all. She also didn't understand sarcasm. She didn't understand exaggeration. And she couldn't fathom what reason there might ever be to justify lying. She was a simple woman, but she was pure and honest and straightforward. If the two of them agreed that werewolves were real and that there had been at least one roving pack of them riding around the Panhandle region back before the Korean War, then I accepted all of that, just as if I had read it in a history textbook at school. The fact that my mother and father didn't believe these stories just made me a bit more alienated from their worldview. My grandparents seemed to have their feet on the same ground that I did, while my parents seemed to think life was like something on Father Knows Best. But even though I see these stories as history, don't go looking for this in any books or even old newspapers. I tried, and I found nothing about any of this. It didn't help that Grandpa refused to give me real names of any of these guys, even though I'm certain he knew at least some of them. He gave them nicknames, and that was all. Lefty, Rusty, Bowser. It sounds like the name of a pack of dogs, and I guess that's what they were. Although all the men seemed to have a girlfriend, that never stopped them from going after waitresses in restaurants and bars. They pretty much never stopped hitting on women. It was like a sport, but also a source of amusement for them. They seemed to be equally as entertained, whether the woman accepted or rejected them. The bright side of these guys was their constantly excited and happy mood, but the downside was their manic nature. Just like how a pack of stray canines can spur each other on to greater violence or mania. They were famous for starting fights in bars, but they were even more famous for finishing them. Everyone knew to stay out of their way, so they had to start picking on military on leave, or tourists who had no clue who or what they were dealing with. Going on a decade-long violent rampage can seem like limitless fun for a while, but pretty soon it's the same old, and you start to look for bigger kicks. Sometimes that means more violence. Sometimes that means sicker takes on things. One of the women introduced the guys to ideas of the occult, and they started holding rituals and trying to create their own new witchcraft or religion. They were trying to make themselves more powerful, and obviously I have no idea if whatever they did worked or not. To me, it sounds like an excuse to act like weirdos and pretend to have superpowers, but I'm not a werewolf practicing sorcery, so what do I know? I find it repulsive that they did animal sacrifice, but I eat hamburgers, so I guess that makes me a hypocrite. I suppose I should be grateful if they kept the sacrifices to animals and leave it at that. My grandfather would whisper that there were casualties of the time of the werewolves on motorcycles. He said there are bodies out in that desert that will never, ever be found. Since he would never get any more detail than that, I didn't know if he was referring to anything he knew specifically, or if he just meant that he assumed a lot of people lost their lives out there to the whims of the pack. It wasn't something that I felt I should press him on, because of the look on his face, which was sort of vulnerable. Grandpa usually was the strong one for all of us, even down to his last days. The few times I saw him looking vulnerable were times when I gave the man a little space and curtailed my personal curiosity. One of the things my grandfather seemed to look back fondly on were the werewolf fighting contests, which the men held occasionally. In that one case, Grandpa seemed to revel in recounting the extreme athleticism displayed by the werewolf men. They had a unique fighting style, which involved both leaping and crawling. Hands and feet were bound to prevent the use of claws in battle, but biting was supposed to be perfectly okay. So you could kick or punch or bite or head bump, basically. The point was to cause the unconsciousness of the other, and so strangulation was allowed, or other ways of cutting off the breathing. If your opponent died, then he also won. So they each generally tried not to end each other's lives. One fight was won when a fighter pretended to be knocked out, until his opponent came close enough that he could kick him in the nads. So if anyone asks you what werewolves do for fun, now you have something you can tell them. Grandpa told me that the last time he saw any of the old werewolves still out on the road, on their chopper, was this one nicknamed Jester, who he saw riding with some much younger hippie bikers in the later 60s. He said Jester looked like he had aged 50 years, but it had been 20, which is long enough when you're living out in the desert. Grandpa said he watched the old werewolf hitting on nearly every young woman that walked down the street. As he was about to leave, he did a double take, as one of the prettiest ladies made a U-turn and started chatting old Jester up. "Oh, Wolfie, ain't you the one?" In fact, Grandpa had story after story of women going out of their way to become available when these hairy monster men showed any interest at all. Girls from rich families, established women with good jobs and loyal husbands. It wasn't just the stragglers that were attracted to these scary dudes. It was all different kinds of ladies from all different kinds of backgrounds. I've heard the same was true for Manson. He used to get daddy's little rich girls in his fold. Grandma told me she once had a conversation with one of the young women traveling with the pack. The girl appeared to be expecting a little baby werewolf. My grandmother was shocked to learn that this girl was the daughter of a banker, but she had run away to become baby mama to a werewolf. My grandmother was not judgmental, but she found this decision-making shocking. Although there were stories of the pack misbehaving around women, my grandparents both insisted that they didn't seem to have any trouble attracting them. They appeared largely monogamous from the outside, but most of the males had at least one female consort. The women usually seemed to also be werewolves, meaning that the werewolfism was something that was passed on without killing the new host, like many venereal diseases. Who knows? Maybe that's how the guys caught werewolfism in Europe. Grandma's sister Eddie heard what was happening, then came over to the house with the intention of defending her sister and telling the bikers to leave. Inside of 10 minutes, one of the bikers was charming her, and before you knew it, she was having conversations with him. When they eventually went back out on the road after another few days, Grandma's sister Eddie went with them. Supposedly, she moved to Alaska with her man in the early 60s to raise a litter of pups up there somewhere. I've never met her, and she was rarely discussed in my childhood, so I don't know what became of Eddie or her family. Grandma said she used to call from the road back through the 1950s, though, and tell her crazy stories over the telephone. According to Eddie, the women in that group were all even crazier than the XGI males. It seemed that when the females became werewolves, they would experience something that was like going into heat, and they would be strongly bonded to their partner for life. The males were dogmen, after all, so they were not as strict about who they partnered with, having insatiable appetites for both the carnage and the carnal. I hope I worded that well enough for YouTube. My point is, Grandma's sister Eddie was very much in love, or at least, she was breathing in a lot of pheromones. Some of the werewolves had a small harem of female followers, who would all battle for status and continually undermine each other. It was the most male-dominated thing I'd heard of in the animal world, outside of how gorillas do it. With gorillas, the top status males get all the females, while most of the male gorillas get no interest from the females at all. With these werewolf packs, though, it seemed that even the lowest status males were worshipped by at least one woman. I don't know if that would also be true for werewolves with day jobs. But it was true for the bad boy biker wolfman who came back from the European theater, changed into something different. Grandma remembered her sister Eddie describing riding her boyfriend's shoulders as the wolf pack rolled into town after town in the desert. It was more fun in the early days when nobody had been expecting them, nor were they prepared to react. In those days, the wolves ran rampant, taking what they wanted and laughing in the faces of those who tried to stop them. Grandpa had told me that you can't kill a werewolf. They don't know how to give up the ghost. Shoot them, and they just keep on coming anyway. Grandma knew more about this than Grandpa, though, because she was given info from her werewolf sister, Eddie. Apparently, you can stop a werewolf with guns. At least, if you have enough of them. The trouble is that these creatures have an advanced kind of healing ability that is utterly different to anything we humans have or even know about. A cut can heal itself so thoroughly that not even a scar is left. Bullet holes heal, torn flesh reconnects, and thus the creature is very hard to slow down. Not impossible, but it's going to take more than a pistol. They never said anything about the bullets needing to be silver, so I don't know if that part is real outside of the movies. Or maybe my grandparents just didn't know about that part, I'm not sure. I know you told me to avoid discussing intoxicants, but I do feel I should mention that pep pills were a big thing for a lot of guys coming back from Europe in the late 1940s. It led to a high-energy, manic lifestyle. Add to that the ability to run as fast as a wolf, and you can see that they wouldn't need to even be on their bikes to run around causing mayhem wherever these guys went. By the mid-1950s, towns in the region were much better prepared to deal with roving gangs, and much of their wild behavior was restricted to times when they were alone out in the desert. The guys learned to switch back to human form when the law was present. They started to pick their fights more selectively, and bit by bit, the werewolves merged into American culture. One would settle in Arizona with one of his women and become accepted locally. Another spent his share of their ill-gotten gains to buy some farming land in Kansas, and another founded a ski lodge in Colorado that is still in business today. There were a few who became career prisoners, it's true, but the majority of the werewolves graduated into normal society. The majority of them became rich, and you've possibly worked for their children or grandchildren. But in the old days, the basically forgotten old days, before they adopted manners and rose to prominence, some of those stately old ladies and men were literally animals. They roamed as a wolf pack. They took what they wanted. They destroyed what they didn't. And they left a wake of fear behind themselves. It's a part of history that I guarantee you will never be told. One of the lost stories of the greatest generation. In fact, I wouldn't even blame you if you presented this story as speculation or even fiction. You don't want to get anyone thinking any of this is real, because those families all still exist. I don't know if werewolfism gets passed down to the next generation or not, but I know that you don't ever want to get on the wrong side of those people. Those very nice people. Those very powerful people. Just because someone says they might have sowed some wild oats back after the war. Why, those men are America itself. Because those men were the werewolves on wheels. Hey there, buddy. Can you dig me? This episode was brought to you by Sonny Montigny. If it came out scary or kind of funny, in either case, say thank you to Sonny. Please join me in thanking Sonny Montigny for making this episode possible. Sonny recently sent us a super thanks by clicking that thanks button located under each of our videos. Thanks, Sonny. If you want to be as cool and awesome as Sonny Montigny, then pay attention to this next part, where our international TV spokesmongrel Henry Lee Dogman will have his say. Frank? Thanks, Biggie, and thanks to all of you for watching this far. If you liked it, please click like. If you'd like to see more of our work, please subscribe. And also click that bell icon if you'd like to be notified when we put out a new episode. To become an executive producer, you can donate to us through the thanks button under each of our videos or through our paypal.me/PeterBernard209 page. To receive cool perks like secret uncensored Dogman episodes far too wild to ever run on this channel, you can become a YouTube channel member by clicking the join button, or join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com. Joining either at the $3 a month level or above gets you access to our over 25 hours of secret uncensored Dogman stories available nowhere else. Do you have a scary story about Dogman or some other kind of high strangeness that happened to you? Let us know by emailing us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com or by leaving us a voicemail message at 804-LA-SCARY. You may need to call back on that one. It cuts off after, I think, 3 minutes. And if you don't want to do any of that stuff, thank you for simply watching to the end. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.